Welcome to the Book Bungalow. This event is part of this 24th annual Utah Humanities Book Festival. This annual free festival is the Utah Humanities gift to the community, allowing us to explore all sorts of ideas by interacting with great writers, and we've got a really good one today. The complete program is available at www.utahhumanities.org. Our thanks to the Book Festival's major sponsors, George S. and Dolores Story Eccles Foundation, the Salt Lake City Arts Council, the Salt Lake County Zoo Arts and Parks Fund, the Summit County RAP, Weber County RAMP, the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies, the King's English Bookshop, Weller Bookworks, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, and Catalyst. We acknowledge that the Book Bungalow, along with so many other bookstores in this country, resides on the original territory once inhabited by the ancestral Puebloans, in our case, and the Fremont indigenous people. Today, southwestern Utah is primarily home to the San Juan Southern Paiute tribe and the Paiute Indian tribe of Utah, a confederation of 5 bands: Cedar, Indian Peaks, Kanash, Kusharam, and Shivwits. Tribes that have been living, working, and residing on this land from time immemorial. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this land, and we honor and respect the indigenous peoples still connected to the land on which we gather. Please let's take a moment of silence to think about and pay respect to the indigenous peoples, both past and present. Through the end of October, the Book Bungalow is continuing to offer a wide variety of author events and even a writing workshop next weekend. As part of the Utah Humanities Book Festival, we invite you to take a look at our schedule on our website and register now if you want to attend an event, whether it's live or virtual. I'll be posting our website link in the chat room, along with a link to order Kate's book and another link to a book festival audience survey. Please take a moment to complete the survey after the event for an opportunity to win a $10 gift card to the King's English in Salt Lake City. And I imagine, even though we're down here, many of us, perhaps it's still usable through their website somehow, I'm not sure. Finally, at the conclusion of Kate's presentation, she will be happy to entertain questions. I have several. You may have many more, so I will ask her one question, and then I will let you all take over with your questions, put them in the Q&A. And with that, I'm going to pass the time over to Kate and let her tell us all about her. Let me tell you, I did not have time to read the book, so I listened to it, the audio book, which is narrated by Kate. And that's the way to, if you're gonna, it's terrific. And it kept me alert and awake all the way to Denver and back, which is a long drive, 9.5-hour drive. So it's a terrific book. And I'm turning the time over to you now, Kate. Thanks and welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. And thank you to the Utah Humanities Book Festival and their sponsors for making tonight's event possible. I am so excited to be here to talk to you about my new book, The Woman They Could Not Silence, but even more importantly, to talk to you about its heroine, the remarkable Elizabeth Packard. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if none of you have heard her name before, because as often happens to feisty women who stand up for themselves in history, history has chosen instead to commemorate those men who tried but failed to silence her. And it has been my honor to restore Elizabeth's legacy and to introduce her to readers. And that's why I'm so excited to do so this evening. She is perhaps the most resilient and fearless woman I have ever encountered. Her story and her spirit are truly remarkable. Her story starts on the cusp of the American Civil War in June 1816. And it starts with Elizabeth, a 43-year-old housewife and mother of 6, lying in bed in her marital home. It starts with a simple question. What would happen if your husband could commit you to an insane asylum just because you disagreed with him? That's what happens to Elizabeth. And at this juncture in the presentation, I want to turn to do a short reading from the book. And part of the reason I've chosen to do a reading is because I want to showcase how I've chosen to tell Elizabeth's story, because this is a non-fiction book. It's a history book. Elizabeth was a real woman from history, but I write in a very novelistic way. So I wanted to give a sense of that for readers. I hope I write in a way that Elizabeth comes to life through these pages and she will ultimately feel like a friend to you. I hope you walk in step with her on her journey. But never forget that this is a non-fiction book. So every line of dialogue, every quotation in the book comes from an authentic historical source, a record made by someone who was present at the time. A diary, a letter, a memoir, everything in the book is factual. So remember that, as I hope you get swept up in the story. So this reading comes from chapter 1 of the book. The date is June 18th, 1816, and the setting is a little town called Manteno in Illinois. It was the last day, but she didn't know it. In truth, we never do, not until it is too late. She woke in a handsome maple bed, body covered by a snow-white counterpane. As her senses resurfaced after a restless night's sleep, Elizabeth Packard's brown eyes blearily mapped the landmarks of her room: embroidered ottoman, mahogany bureau, and smart green shutters that, for some reason, were failing to let in any light. Ordinarily, her husband of 21 years, Theophilus, a preacher, would have been snoring next to her, his gravity-defying curly red hair an impromptu pillow beneath his head. But a few long weeks before, he'd abandoned their marital bed. He thought it best, or so he'd said, to sleep alone these days. Instead, her senses were filled by the precious proximity of her slumbering 6-year-old son. Her children were truly the sun, moon, and stars to Elizabeth. To see their happy faces and laughing eyes offered such blessed light. It was particularly welcome in a world that was becoming, by the day, increasingly black. Such melancholy thoughts were uncharacteristic for Elizabeth. In normal times, the 43-year-old was always rejoicing. But the splits that were even now threatening her country, with some forecasting an all-out civil war, were mirrored in her small domestic sphere, within her neat 2-story home. Over the past 4 months, she and her husband had retreated behind those enemy lines, prompting much anxious foreboding from Elizabeth. The Packards had married in 1839, when Elizabeth was a green 22 and Theophilus a dusty 37. At first, all had seemed well. Elizabeth had been raised to be a silent listener, and her preacher husband contentedly became the sole mouthpiece in their marriage. To make him happy was the height of my ambition, Elizabeth wrote. That's all I wanted, to make my husband shine inside and out. The problem in their marriage had been he didn't make her shine in return. Where Elizabeth was vibrant, sociable, and curious, Theophilus was gloomy, timorous, and, in his own words, dull. Their characters were as opposite as it was possible to get. Elizabeth described their marriage as cheerless. Nevertheless, she said nothing to him directly. That is, until everything changed. In 1848, the first Women's Rights Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York, unleashing a national conversation about the rights of women. It was one in which Elizabeth and, less willingly, Theophilus took part. Countless times, the couple had warm discussions on the subject. It was Elizabeth, naturally blessed with a most rare command of language, who triumphed in these fights. Yet her victories came at a cost. She felt the demonstration of her intellect prompted jealousy, lest I outshine him. Theophilus was stung to the quick, and his grievances slowly grew. He was the kind of man who counted them like pennies, recording slights in his diary with the miserly accuracy of a rich man unwilling to share his wealth. He grumbled crossly, "My wife was unfavorably affected by the tone of society, and zealously espoused almost all new notions and wild vagaries that came along." Perhaps the notion that caused him most consternation? In Elizabeth's words, "I, though a woman, have just as good a right to my opinion as my husband has to his." Elizabeth's newfound autonomy was anathema to Theophilus. "Wives, obey your husbands" became a scriptural passage oft quoted in their home. But Elizabeth was no longer silently listening. Defiantly, she kept on articulating her own thoughts, asserting her own self, inspired by the women's rights movement that it was her right to do so. Theophilus's response was telling. He did not allow his wife agency. He did not encourage her independence. Instead, he wrote that he had sad reason to fear his wife's mind was getting out of order. She was becoming insane on the subject of women's rights. On the morning of June 18th, 1860, Elizabeth shifted uncomfortably in bed, her disquiet slowly intensifying. Over the past 4 months, Theophilus had made it plain he wanted her gone. He could not cope with his newly outspoken wife, with her independent mind and her independent spirit, not least because Elizabeth did not keep her new character confined to their home. She asserted herself in public too. In the face of her impassioned eloquence, Theophilus felt powerless and furiously impotent. He conceived a plan. He kept it simple, just 7 words intended to silence her once and for all. When the Packards next argued, he warned Elizabeth, if she did not conform, "I shall put you into the asylum." Now you might think, as Elizabeth Packard did, well, what a ridiculous thing to say. Of course, he can't send her away to a mental hospital simply because she disagrees with him. Of course, he can't dispatch her to an insane asylum just because she has a mind of her own. But there you, like Elizabeth, would be wrong. Because as crazy as it seems to us today, in the 19th century, actually, women were regularly committed for acts of self-assertion. And indeed, as Theophilus begins to make his plan known to his parishioners, he finds that actually they're on his side. As Elizabeth's confidence grows in herself, she decides that summer that she does not want to worship with her husband's church anymore, and so she leaves it to go and worship with the Methodists instead. Now, this was the final straw as far as the parishioners were concerned. As they put it, she would not leave the church unless she was insane. But in their eyes, the evidence had been stacking up long before that. They actually signed a petition supporting Theophilus's plan, a petition that said Elizabeth should be speedily dispatched to the asylum as quickly as it could be conveniently done. Their evidence for this, the evidence for her madness, was that one of them had seen Elizabeth shouting at her husband because he had not cleaned the yard. But in this vision of an angry woman who dared to use her voice, the parishioners saw madness. Another parishioner confided that Elizabeth had said she disliked her husband because of the way he was trying to control her, but this too was seen as madness. After all, a woman in the 19th century was supposed to be a happy wife and mother, completely content in her domestic sphere. To express dislike for the man she had married seemed a kind of madness to them. Perhaps the final nail in her coffin, however, was that Elizabeth, according to the parishioners, would engage in incessant talking. And in this talkative woman, they once again saw madness. And so, to Elizabeth's shock, the community was on her husband's side. And not only that, when Theophilus applied to send her away to the hospital, the doctors took his side too, because actually it was the received medical wisdom of the age that an assertive woman was a mad woman. It was something that they used a diagnosis called moral insanity to cover. And the definition of moral insanity was simply eccentricity of conduct. But of course, eccentricity of conduct, like beauty, is all in the eye of the beholder. And in the 19th century, to be a woman who was assertive or ambitious, a woman who pushed the boundaries of that domestic sphere she was supposed to be happy in, well, that was seen as eccentric and therefore mad. It was essentially a medicalization of female behavior, and it meant that any woman who pushed the boundaries of what a woman was supposed to be was swiftly dispatched to an asylum and branded insane. In Elizabeth's case, she actually had two strikes against her, because not only was she an assertive woman, she was an educated woman too. And in the 19th century, any woman who used her brain, even for something as simple as reading, was seen as liable to go mad. In 1858, for example, a doctor toured an all-girls high school and remarked to its teachers, "You are training your girls for the lunatic asylum." To explain the theory behind this diagnosis and this assumption, we can turn to Dr. Andrew McFarland. He was the superintendent of the Illinois State Hospital and the doctor to whom Theophilus Packard applied when he wanted to send his wife away. McFarland wrote that when minds of limited capacity to comprehend subjects tried to do so, it ultimately led to mental breakdown. Indeed, when I pored over the records of the Illinois State Hospital, they published biennial reports that are publicly available now, I found listed in them the so-called causes of insanity of those people who had been locked up within their solid brick walls. And listed there in black and white was the cause of insanity, novel reading. For women to read novels in the 19th century was a dangerous practice indeed. And in fact, in May 1860, just the month before Elizabeth is waking up feeling disquieted on that June morning, I found evidence of a young woman known only as B, who was 15 years old, who had been committed to a lunatic hospital. Her only so-called symptom of madness was that she had become greatly addicted to reading novels. But once again, this medicalization of female behavior saw women swiftly dispatched to hospitals and there locked up behind barred windows. And so too in the case of Elizabeth Packard. On a hot June evening in 1860, she climbed the stone steps of the Illinois State Hospital and found that the doors slammed shut behind her. At first, Elizabeth was not too perturbed. Okay, the doctors had taken her husband's side, but no matter. She would apply to the law for remedy and release. But to Elizabeth's shock and horror, here too she found that the law took her husband's side. In fact, there was a law known as coverture, which was in operation in America at that time. It had first been drafted in the 1100s and had been inherited from England. It seems we Brits have a lot to answer for. And coverture said simply this: in law, the husband and the wife are one, and that one is the husband. It meant that civilly, women had no legal identity at all. They had no rights to property, no rights to their own earnings, no right to the custody of their children, no right even to their very liberty. In Illinois in 1860, husbands could send their wives to asylums simply by request, and specifically without the evidence of insanity that was required in other cases. And we may think of these laws as historic, but to my shock, actually, they echoed throughout the 20th century too. So for example, did you know that it wasn't until 1974 that a woman in America could get a credit card independently? Before then, a man had to co-sign any credit application, and the banks would also discount a woman's earnings by as much as 50% when deciding how much credit to grant. In Switzerland, meanwhile, a wife would have to ask her husband's permission to work or even to open a bank account until 1985. So we may think of these laws as historic, but actually they did remain in place for an awfully long time. In Elizabeth's case, she found that the odds were stacked against her. There was no legal remedy that she could draw on to get out. And she quickly realized the reality of her situation as she woke the following morning on 7th Ward in the Illinois State Hospital. She walked down the long hospital corridors to the dining room and there found that she was surrounded by other women who had been incarcerated for the exact same reason. Women sent away by their husbands or their fathers or their brothers, whatever male authority figure had control over these women. They were sent away for defying all domestic control, women who had ungovernable personalities or simply what is known as nerve. These women were literally textbook examples of female insanity, according to the doctors of the time. And Elizabeth found that the ward was completely full of them. And she too, therefore, found a sisterhood of sorts, because all these women had been sent away simply for trying to be themselves. The fact that the ward was overcrowded also brings to light, however, another reality about 19th century psychiatry. In fact, the wards were so overcrowded that Dr. Andrew McFarland had recently applied for funding to open an entire new wing of the hospital. There would be space to commit another 150 patients, and every single one of them would be a woman. Because in the 19th century, actually, you didn't have to be assertive or ambitious or educated to be seen as a madwoman. Simply being a woman was enough for doctors to send you away and for doctors to consider that you were mad. They thought the simple possession of a female body was enough to cause madness. They called it something called uterine derangement. They thought that a woman's genitals and sexual organs, her menstrual cycle, would be enough to send her mad. And so prevalent was this theory that mothers in the 19th century were actually encouraged to try to delay the onset of their daughters' periods, because the menstrual cycle was seen as so dangerous that they wanted these young women to, escape that fate for as long as they possibly could. The medical advice that the mothers were supposed to follow were to keep their daughters away from reading novels, of course, from sleeping in feather beds, and from eating red meat. This apparently would stave off that dangerous menstrual cycle for as long as possible. Elizabeth observed the goings-on in the hospital with her innately intelligent and observant eye, and she quickly realized what was going on. She described the treatment that the women were receiving at the hospital as a subduing treatment. The women were supposed to learn how to submit to masculine authority. The doctors became ciphers for those absent family members. In fact, Dr. Andrew McFarlane described the relationship between him and his patients, with himself as Prospero and the unruly women as Caliban. He was there to tame them and then send them home. Elizabeth herself was told she could go home very quickly within a matter of days or weeks, if only she would return to Theophilus as an obedient wife. But as Elizabeth herself wrote, "In my case, this woman-crushing machinery works the wrong way. The true woman shines brighter and brighter under the process instead of being strangled." And this is what makes Elizabeth Packard such a special woman, because it's through this crucible of suffering, of being a sane woman in an insane asylum in the 19th century, that actually Elizabeth becomes the woman they could not silence. She finds her voice and determines to use it to save not only herself, but the sisterhood around her too. Elizabeth is forbidden to have a voice, and not only orally, but also on paper too. She's forbidden any stationery, any writing equipment. And yet Elizabeth decides to keep a secret journal. She tears the margins out of the newspapers that are scattered around the ward. She squirrels away pieces of fabric from the sewing room. And these become her canvas to record her thoughts, to record what she's witnessing every day in the asylum, to record herself on the page, the woman that she is becoming. And what's remarkable about her story, and one of the things that I love most about her story, is that it's the story of a woman becoming herself, a woman finding her voice. And it charts Elizabeth's journey from housewife to historically significant heroine, someone who successfully battles ultimately to improve the rights of women and the mentally ill. She does indeed not only make the world a better place for herself, but actually she changes the world so that other women will not suffer as she has. And she uses her incredible brain, her incredible writing talent in order to do that. And even the very fact that she manages ultimately to get out of the asylum and to make her mark on the world is a tribute to her strength and her spirit and the way that she battles against all these obstacles and overcomes them. But make no mistake, though this is a history book, the issues at its heart could not be more modern. And this is actually how I came to the story. So Elizabeth's story for me didn't start on the cusp of the American Civil War in June 1860. It started in the fall of 2017, amid the fire of the Me Too movement. Everywhere that fall, women were speaking up and speaking out against sexual harassment, misogyny, sexual assault, rape, and finally, we were being listened to and believed. That was what really struck me about that fall and about the movement. Honestly, women have always spoken up, but to be believed, to be given credit for what we were saying, that was the remarkable thing. And it got me thinking, well, why has it taken so long, and how have women been silenced in the past? And as I sat at my kitchen table in London, thinking about these ideas, thinking about what I wanted to write next as an author, I realized, my thoughts coalesced around this single realization. For centuries, whenever women have used our voices, we've been called crazy. Our mental health has been wielded as a weapon against us, used to undermine and control us. And actually, that still happens to this very day. Just think about this summer and everything that Britney Spears is going through. Here, we have a so-called madwoman, a woman who is at the mercy of her male family members, fighting to get out of the shackles of that legal control. We have a woman who, by her own admission, felt the only way to survive it was to submit to their will, to post happy, smiling pictures on Instagram. Here we have a woman who, anytime she asserted herself, for example, by deciding she didn't want to do a certain dance move, she would be punished psychiatrically. We see so many parallels in the story of Elizabeth Packard, and here we are in the summer of 2021. Think too about our public political figures, women like Hillary Clinton or Nancy Pelosi or Vice President Kamala Harris. Every single one of those women has been called a madwoman, has been called hysteric, has had Donald Trump tweeting, "There's something wrong with her upstairs." This is the label and the brush that tars women and tries to silence our voices. And for me, this is what I wanted to write about, because these issues are still so current in the modern day. But I didn't want to write a polemic. As I hope the sample chapter illustrated at the top of this presentation, I am above all else a storyteller. So what I wanted to do was to try to find one woman in history whose story would allow me to explore and expose and discuss these issues that still resonate today, but to do so through the prism of her experiences. And so I went looking for Elizabeth Packard. I didn't know her name. I didn't know the era about which my book would be set. I simply fell down a rabbit warren of internet searches about women and madness. And on the 15th of January, 2018, in a University of Wisconsin essay that I randomly found online, 4 pages in, a single paragraph, I first read the name Elizabeth Packard. There was enough in that paragraph to get me digging deeper. And as I did dig deeper into her story and what had happened to her, I realized very quickly she was the one, the woman I wanted to write about next. Because what a woman she is. She was truly extraordinary, not only a brilliant literary voice, not only an incredible woman with spirit and heart and intelligence, but also a woman who, she was described as having this irresistible magnetism. She was a woman who would be the center of every circle that she found herself in. She was a woman who would literally sell herself because she was so charismatic. She just had this extraordinary spirit, and I fell in love with the way that she conducted herself and the way she can act as a shining example to all of us. I just thought she was amazing. And as I realized what she'd been through too, for a writer like me, her story was such a gift because it has so much drama and action in it. Almost in the first few chapters, you've got men hacking their way with axes into Elizabeth's bedroom to cart her off to the asylum. This is a story with courtroom drama in it, as Elizabeth embarks on a landmark legal fight for justice. It's a story with a twist of Gothic horror as I take you inside the insane asylums of the 19th century. It's a story with shocking scientific historical facts, but above all else, it's a story with a compelling heroine, a heroine who embarks on a ceaseless fight for justice against injustice that still resonates today. And this, for me, was everything that I wanted to write about in the book. But as I started researching her story, very quickly, I realized I was going to be up against it, because there is no Elizabeth Packard special collection where you can go and research who she was and everything that she achieved. In fact, there is no memorial to Elizabeth anywhere. There is, however, a mental health center in Illinois that's named after Dr. Andrew McFarland, the doctor who kept this same woman incarcerated in the insane asylum for all those years that she was put away. What I did find, however, and what a gift, were Elizabeth's own books. because that secret journal that she had kept in the asylum, she later published. And this and her many memoirs were for me the window into her world. And if you read The Woman They Could Not Silence, Elizabeth truly is unsilenced. She will speak to you through the pages of my book because I've used her words to allow her to tell us exactly what it was like to be a sane woman in an insane asylum. And she tells us in her own words every twist of the story, every rise and fall, every high and low. She is there telling us exactly what she had gone through and exactly what she was thinking and feeling. And I hope it makes for a very intimate narrative because we hear from Elizabeth herself. And to illustrate just how amazing she was, she publishes her books after she manages to get out from the asylum. But even that in itself is extraordinary because no publisher will touch them. As happens in the modern day too, the stigma of insanity haunts her and no publisher will take her books. And Elizabeth at this stage in the narrative is penniless and homeless and has literally just the dress that she's standing up in and the capital of her health and her intelligence. And she uses it. Elizabeth, in an illustration of just how forward-thinking and phenomenal she was, actually crowd funds the publication of her books. She goes from door to door, telling her story, persuading people through her sheer magnetism that they should invest just 50 cents in her, in this book that has not yet been published. And in a few months' time, they will receive their copy. And in this way, she manages to print her books and they become bestsellers. And therefore, they endure to this day. And I've been able to use them in my book. What a remarkable woman she was. For my book, I didn't just want to rely on Elizabeth's words, as incredible as they are and as beautifully written as they are. I wanted to find out about my antagonists as well. And I was lucky enough to find the memoir and diaries of her husband. So I have first person material from him as well. And I also drew on the letters and the public writings of Dr. Andrew McFarland. So we can hear from all the parties in their own words exactly what they thought and felt about this situation. As a writer and simply as a reader myself, I was personally fascinated by the insane asylum aspect of the narrative. And so for me, one of the most enthralling and interesting parts of my research was poring over the records of the insane asylum. I'm a writer and a reader who has loved books like Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar or Ken Casey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, The Yellow Wallpaper. These were books that have inspired me. And so I really loved delving into the realities of what an insane asylum in the 19th century was like. And there were some really dark gems to uncover there. For example, Elizabeth wrote about how she and her fellow patients would go and work in the sewing room of the hospital. And in the asylum's own reports, it listed what the women were making. It included their own restraining jackets. The women actually had to make their own straight jackets in the sewing room with which they would later be contained and controlled. Perhaps the darkest part of my research, however, was delving into the medical journals of the era. Now, I mentioned earlier about how women's genitals were seen as the cause of their madness. Therefore, many of the treatments of the era focused on these too. And by far the most shocking treatment that I uncovered in my research was a treatment called a clitoridectomy. And it is exactly as you would expect it to be from that name. The doctors would cut off the women's clitorises, what we would call today female genital mutilation. To read the records of the women who had endured this procedure was simply heartbreaking because they included a 20-year-old woman whose only so-called symptom of madness was that she liked to engage in serious reading. Another woman was a 30-year-old wife. Again, her so-called symptom of madness was that she had expressed dislike for the society of her husband. For these reasons alone, the women were put under the knife and had their clitorises removed. Absolutely horrifying and shocking to read about these things. But perhaps the most shocking aspect is that it wasn't simply a historic practice that I read about. In fact, clitoridectomies to correct emotional disorder in the Western world continued until the 1940s. The last recorded case was on a 5-year-old girl. The more I learned about my subject, the more passionate I became. And that passion took me to America, and I followed in Elizabeth Packard's own footsteps. I went to visit her marital hometown of 20 years before she'd moved west, a place called Shelburne in Massachusetts. It's way up in the north of the state, way up in the mountains, and it's a place where the landscape itself speaks deafeningly of what has always been and always will be. It's mountainous, it's covered in trees, the very houses creak with age. And it was so insightful to then travel, as Elizabeth did, to the plains of the Midwest and to stand under those glorious open skies, seeing nothing for miles and miles, and to realize you can make a blank canvas of your own life. Elizabeth saw the possibilities in that and grasped them with both hands. While I was in Illinois, I went to worship one Sunday at the church where Elizabeth's husband had preached. I stood and sat with the congregation. Our voices rose and fell in unison, and it really gave me an insight into how brave Elizabeth was to break away from that cohesive choreography and that community feeling, to break out on her own and follow what she believed in. As a wonderful coda, that church is now led by a female pastor. And I just thought that was brilliant, that this church that in the 19th century had tried to silence a woman is now led by a female pastor every single Sunday. Perhaps the most powerful part of my research trip, however, was to travel to Jacksonville, Illinois, which is where the asylum was that Elizabeth was held in. Like her, I travelled past the stone gateposts that mark the borders of the asylum grounds. They're very old now, of course, the stone is crumbling, yet they remain twice the height of a woman. And there is a very real sense of crossing over as you move from the roar of civilization into the quiet of what is now a community park. Elizabeth had written of an infant orchard that was being planted. Now those trees are now grown to maturity, and they were so many and so verdant that when the wind whistled through them, it sounded like a chorus of voices just trying to be heard. To my disappointment, Old Main, the hospital building in which Elizabeth herself had been held, was demolished in 1984. I was 30 years too late to see it myself. However, I did speak to locals who used to break into this abandoned mental hospital as teenagers and traverse those long corridors by flashlight, seeking out the secrets of the insane asylum. When they knocked the building down, they kept the limestone windowsills because over the centuries, patients had etched messages into the sills, words and pictures, trying to be heard. And those voices did still reach out even after the building had gone. A few years afterwards, they found a tranche of unmarked graves. The patients were always buried in unmarked graves, but this lot had been completely forgotten about. No record had existed of them, and then they found them. Though the main building had gone, there were several auxiliary buildings, also abandoned, still dotted around the site. And it was still haunting for me to peer into the windows of those abandoned hospital buildings, to glimpse the unfurling stalactites of peeling paint that unfurled from the underside of the staircases, looking like underwater seaweed or a drowning woman's hair. I glimpsed orphan furniture inside, a desk, a chair, a hat stand with no hats. And the buildings were graffitied. Don't open, dead inside. But I think it is important to open the doors to the past, because through them step people like Elizabeth Packard, with her spirit as wide as her cage crinoline skirt. Elizabeth wrote, "Women are made to fly and soar, not to creep and crawl as the haters of our sex want us to." And I think Elizabeth's greatest legacy is not the laws that she changed or the way that she made the world a better place even. Her greatest legacy is that she teaches us all what we can achieve if we believe in ourselves, if we decide to follow our own path and our own dreams, to be true to ourselves ultimately, because that's what she did in defiance of everyone telling her she was wrong and she was mad and she shouldn't be herself. She shook them all off like they were nothing, and she rose like a phoenix from that fire and that flame of that insane asylum, and she flew and she soared just as she thought women should do. Her legacy is that she burns brighter than anyone else, and she shows us all that we can do it too. She wrote, "I will not hide my light under a bushel. I shall set it upon a candlestick that it may give light to others." And to all our benefit, Elizabeth Packard's light still shines, and you can read all about it in The Woman They Could Not Silence. I hope her light touches your lives just as it has done mine. Thank you.
Wow. That was a tremendous presentation. And wow.
Thank you.
I want to share, first of all, Susan Kassler wrote, "Thank you for this work of love. In discussing your book with my 86-year-old mother, I learned that in the state of New York, my great-great-grandmother was committed to the Ogdensburg Asylum and died there. The year was somewhere in the late 1940s. My mother and grandmother all attest she was not insane. Rather, she was outspoken against injustice and could be mean about it. She lived next to her brother's gas station business in Chautauqua, New York. I may be mispronouncing that. Her crime? She railed at the local rednecks who sprayed her apartment with gravel as they peeled out on their exit from the gas station. If it were not for your book, I may have never known this family story." My mother's response? "Well, Susan, these things happened long after the 1800s. Indeed. Thank you."
Yeah, I just got chills up my spine. Yeah, it still happens even to this day as well. That's the really shocking and horrifying thing. But it's partly why I wanted to write the book, so that we could talk about them and shine a light on them. So
Yeah.
thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah. Thanks, Susan, for sharing that. I was just going to ask a couple of questions and then get out of the way.
Sure.
I have a lot more in case nobody speaks up. But first, I just wondered, since you're British, did you delve into the British asylum system at the same time? How did it compare with ours in America at this period?
My focus was on America, but I did, in the course of my reading, I did read some books and some journals and so on that focus more on the British side of things. Very similar is the answer. Well, I say weird, it probably isn't that weird. The British and the Europeans did more experimental treatments. The Americans did not, and actually make the point in the book that the sort of American Journal of Insanity remarks how extraordinary it is that there aren't actually that many original publications from American institutions and American doctors at that time. All of the experimental stuff was happening in Europe. And actually that's just as well for Elizabeth, because it meant that she wasn't subject to some of the treatments that I described in the presentation. And that was partly because the asylums became so overcrowded so quickly in America that the doctors were focused more on sort of management, trying to control the patients. Ultimately they ended up dealing with these sort of vast complexes that had hundreds, if not thousands, of patients, and it was all about corralling these people, this herd of people to try and sort that out, rather than conducting experiments trying to get into people's brains and really treat them in any way. It changed in that way. So that's probably the key difference, but the thinking, the theories, that was the same, both sides of the Atlantic.
Okay. Does anyone out there, I wanted to save my last question for last, but if, I know that, sorry, I'm in my office, but I sometimes get interrupted. I think you talked about how you decided to focus on her story in particular in all your research.
Yeah, I can expand on that a little. I mean, as I say, when I first started researching and looking for a story, I didn't know which era I was going to land in. And initially I was looking more in the 20th century, and I was looking at things like lobotomies and electric shock treatments. But actually I found that those stories they all had horrendous endings, because the women did end up silenced. You have a lobotomy that especially if it goes badly wrong, you have no voice. You are going to end up mute and unable to communicate, if operate sort of sensibly in any way. Sometimes that just completely robbed people of personality, and they ended up, comatose vegetables, basically. So those stories were obviously horrendously depressing, and what I did want to do, as well as to explore these issues, was to try and write an uplifting and inspiring book as well. Having written The Radium Girls, which is incredibly tragic, but I think it does have an empowering message in it as well. I wanted to do the same here, to look at the horror, but also to say, actually, you can rise above it. And ultimately, what was so brilliant about Elizabeth's story was not only the drama in it, it was not only the books that she wrote that gave me that insightful first person account, it was the fact that she beats the system and she beats the patriarchy. And she shows us all, as I said in the talk, she shows us what we can do and how we can defy these constraints that are put on us by society. And what happens if we do. Yes, she was locked up, but as I say, she rose like a phoenix, bigger and better and brighter than she ever had been before. And it's one of the sort of ironies for her husband that had he never sent her away, she would never have achieved everything that she later went on to achieve. Right. But yeah, so partly why I chose the story was because it does have a happy ending, and that's something that I was looking for as well.
Yeah. By the way, I apologize. I forgot to formally introduce you and give your backstory.
Oh, that's all right.
For those who, yes, she's the New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of The Radium Girls. It won several awards. And anyway, I'm not seeing any other questions. You're all being shy. Okay. If Elizabeth were alive today, what current wrong do you think she'd be most apt to try and right?
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, Elizabeth was someone that she wrote in an impassioned way in the asylum about how she wanted women in Congress, in the Senate, in the president's chair. So that isn't a wrong, but I think she would, she'd really want there to be a female president, and to show that we could do that, that would be something she'd turn her attention to. Unfortunately, there's too many to pick from, aren't there, really?
Yeah.
Elizabeth is all about voices being heard. So I think she'd want representation, and she'd be pleased, I think, by the advances that we've made recently in society about how we treat people with mental illness and that sort of thing. I think that would be good, but she'd want us to go further. You know, she was a pioneer in sort of seeing the humanity in people. You know, it used to be that the mentally ill were sort of called the beasts who raved at Bedlam. You know, people would literally pay shillings to go and see mentally ill people, you know, wail and cry and rave. Elizabeth was someone who saw the humanity in them. And so I think she'd be pleased with what we've done, but would want to go further.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I only wish she was here to fight those battles, because she, you know, she got stuff done. So
She
we could
did.
do with someone like her on our side.
Becky asks, can you describe the A4 printout, your book plan, which you check off and annotate as you go along? As an aspiring writer, I struggle with organization of resource materials.
Yes, I can. Thank you for asking that question. I always like talking about organizing my materials. So the A4 book plan is the final thing that I do before I start writing. So the groundwork to it is poring over every single record, you know, whether that is you know, a medical journal about the clitoridectomies, whether it's Elizabeth's own book, whether it's the asylum's published report. I give every source its own unique code. That is plotted into a timeline, which I just do in Word. It's got 3 columns. It has the date something happened, what happened, and then the source reference. So if it's from the Library of Congress, it might be LC 101, page 5. Okay, that goes into the column. I plot every single source in this timeline, which is a chronological timeline. The book plan comes once that's all done, because I don't necessarily tell the story chronologically in the sense of where there are reveals. I obviously want to plot that material later than it would be, because it's going to act as a reveal to the audience. But so the book plan is almost in places, paragraph by paragraph. You know, this is where I'm going to talk about the kind of restraints that they had on the ward. This is where the story about, you know, Elizabeth getting punched or whatever it is, this is where that happens. And so I really plot it carefully, and that is cross-referenced with my chronological timeline. So when I get to that scene of Elizabeth being punched, I can go to the timeline, which has all my sources, and basically means I can find quotes in seconds and review all the relevant source material before I write a scene. So it's all fresh in my head. I know which quotations from Elizabeth or whoever I want to use. And the book plan is chapter by chapter. Chapter 1, I'm, you know, doing this bit, that, you know, here I am describing the asylum, and it's all those page numbers of the chronological timeline I need to reference. And I go through and I print it out, because I have so many files open when I'm drawing on sources that it's useful to have a printout by my side that I can just physically consult and, as I say, tick off as I go along. So
does the printout show chapter 1 and then some of those codes? Like that's where you want to put them?
It says chapter 1. It sometimes does list the date. I think it's the what happened, or you know, the scene, or I want to put this thing in about restraints, or I want to just describe this day. And then the code on the book plan is the page number of the chronological timeline. So then I go to the chronological timeline, and that has LC 101 for my Library of Congress file. Okay. If that makes sense.
Is that clear enough for you, Becky? Or do you want to?
I don't know if that's too much information or not enough. Or, and it does take a lot of time, but it's worth it, because then I write really quickly once I get going. That's what it enables me to do.
Well, she said,
and obviously, as always happens, some things change sometimes in the writing. You know, it's just like, oh, this chapter's too long. I try and feel as I'm planning how long a chapter should be. But sometimes you get there and you spend a bit more time than you anticipated, and you're like, actually, I either have to cut this or I have to move it later.
She said thank you, so she must have understood.
Good. I'll shut up about that.
Did you develop that before for the Radium Girls, or have you been using this for so long?
I've been using that basis ever since I've started writing full length, sort of 70,000 word books. To be honest, the more complex ones need the separate book plan at the end. If it's a simpler book, I can write it from the chronological timeline, because there isn't as much material. But otherwise, if it's more intense and there's loads of sources, as in the history books, I need a separate book plan to help organize me.
Okay, last question from Katie wants to know what's coming next.
Oh, well, I have to say, I wish I knew the answer. I'm currently searching for my next subject. I have had some ideas, but I'm just not sold on them quite yet. So I'm continuing my hunt in the hope that I'm going to find something that sets my heart beating a little bit faster than the ones I've currently got, I think.
Do you always focus on a women or a woman, or are you open to?
I would be open to other ideas, and honestly, if anyone has any ideas, please do message me. But yeah, no, I'd be open to writing about other things, but I think I do enjoy telling women's stories, and I think my readers enjoy hearing about female stories. So I suspect the next one will also be a woman, but that's not to say I would never write a male story or a book with a male protagonist.
Well, we certainly appreciate them.
Thank you.
If there are no other questions, let me check the queue. No one's putting anything in the Q&A. Thank you from everybody. And
thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thanks so much for spending this time with us and answering these questions. And remember, if you want a copy of The Woman Who Could Not Be Silenced, you can stop by the store if you're local or order through our website. I put the link in the chat. I will be sending a follow-up email with the link to the recording, which you should feel free to share with friends, because I think it would be well worth a lot of women's time. And I'll include the link again to order the book and such. So thanks everybody, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thanks everyone. Good night.